Nuns at St. Cecilia's convent began turning up pregnant, one after another. Everyone thought it was impossible, until hidden cameras revealed a secret so unthinkable it shook the church to its core. Stay with us, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, trust, and compassion. And before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. St. Cecilia's convent stood on a quiet hillside, its stone walls rising like a fortress of faith. Life inside followed an unbroken rhythm: bells at dawn, silent meals, hours of prayer, and endless work. For decades, Mother Superior Margaret O'Donnell guarded this rhythm with iron discipline. She believed strict devotion was the only way to preserve purity in a world that had long since forgotten it. Margaret carried herself like a commander of souls. Every schedule was precise, every silence sacred. The novices respected her firmness, even feared it, but they also leaned on her gentler side, the side that tucked a blanket around them in the infirmary or whispered comfort in the confessional. To Margaret, the convent was not just stone and ritual, it was her family. That's why the knock on her office door unsettled her. Sister Beatrice, her loyal second-in-command, entered hesitantly, her composure fractured. "Mother," she said, voice low, "you must come at once. Novice Elena Cruz, she is very ill." Margaret rose without hesitation, her robe sweeping the floor as she followed Beatrice. The long corridor carried the weight of centuries, candles flickering in their sconces, footsteps echoing off polished stone. At the end of the hall, in a cramped bathroom, a small cluster of sisters knelt around Elena. The young novice was slumped against the cold tiles, her face pale, her body shaking. "She hasn't eaten in days," one whispered. "She cannot stop retching," another added. The room smelled faintly of sickness and lavender soap, a sharp contrast to the solemn quiet of the convent. Margaret knelt, her voice steady. "Child, what troubles you?" Elena's lips quivered as she whispered, "Dizzy, sick. My stomach churns with every breath. I cannot keep anything down." Margaret slipped an arm beneath her, helping her rise. It was then her breath caught. Beneath the folds of Elena's habit, there was no mistaking it, the rounded swell of a belly that had no place here. Her hand froze against the fabric, her mind reeling. For a heartbeat, the room fell silent. The truth was undeniable. Novice Elena was pregnant. Margaret's gaze darted to Beatrice, who stood frozen, her face ashen. No words passed between them, but the horror in their eyes was enough. In a convent that had been sealed from the outside world, in a place devoted to chastity, the impossible had just taken root. Margaret forced herself to stay composed before the others. "Help her to the infirmary," she commanded, her voice controlled but heavy. "Not a word leaves this room until I say so." As the sisters obeyed, Margaret stood in the corridor, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles whitened. The unthinkable had entered her convent, and she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, a hush hung over St. Cecilia's. Though Margaret had forbidden whispers, rumors always find cracks in silence. Sisters passed each other with downcast eyes, and every cough, every tremor of illness was suddenly viewed with suspicion. Margaret brought in Dr. Lillian Harper under the cover of night. The physician was discreet, respectful of the convent's sacred boundaries, but her face betrayed alarm after examining Elena. "Mother Margaret," she said gravely, "there is no doubt. She is several months with child." Margaret dismissed her with a nod, though her chest felt tight with disbelief. Alone, she whispered, "How can this be, Lord? In a place where no man sets foot, how could this seed take root?" Days stretched into weeks. The sisters prayed, but unease simmered beneath every hymn. Then came the second blow. 2 more novices, pale and trembling, came to Beatrice. Both complained of the same sickness, the same relentless nausea. Their bellies too showed the same unmistakable swelling. Margaret's hands trembled as she received them in her office. She asked quietly, "Have you been touched? Have you left the walls? Tell me the truth." Both shook their heads desperately, eyes wide with sincerity. One whispered through tears, "Mother, I have never left. I swear it." Margaret wanted to believe them, needed to believe them, but the evidence mocked her faith. She paced her chambers late into the night, torn between trust in her daughters and the damning reality before her. It was then Sister Beatrice broke the silence. "Mother," she said carefully, "if truth hides in shadow, then light must expose it. We must see what happens when no one knows we are watching." Margaret froze. The suggestion was blasphemous. spying in a house of God. Yet the faces of her sick novices burned in her mind. Her duty to protect them outweighed her shame. So, with a heavy heart, she gave the order. Small hidden cameras were installed throughout the convent, tucked into corners of kitchens, corridors, even in the chapel itself. As she placed one beneath the carved altar, Margaret whispered a prayer for forgiveness. Night after night, she and Beatrice pored over grainy footage. Hours of prayer, candlelight, and sleep filled the screens. Nothing more. Their eyes grew weary, hope slipping away. But then, one night, the silence broke. Margaret sat upright as the camera in the chapel flickered to life, capturing a sight that froze her blood. Several novices, cloaked in shadows, slipped into the chapel after curfew. Their movements were cautious, deliberate, as if guarding a secret. Beatrice leaned forward, her whisper trembling. "They're hiding something." Margaret's heart thundered. Whatever truth they had been dreading lay just beyond that chapel door, and she knew she would have to face it, not through a screen, but with her own eyes. The chapel lay cloaked in stillness when Mother Margaret and Sister Beatrice slipped inside. By day, its marble floors and towering crucifix offered comfort. Tonight, the air was heavy with suspicion. Margaret's candle cast uneasy shadows across the altar as she scanned the room for anything out of place. They moved slowly, every sound magnified in the silence. Beatrice's sandal struck the floor with a hollow echo. Both women froze, then knelt to press against the stone. Beneath one tile, Margaret's hand caught a seam. Together, they lifted it, revealing a hidden trapdoor. The wooden hatch creaked as it opened, releasing a breath of cold, earthy air. A narrow staircase spiraled downward. Margaret descended first, candlelight trembling against the damp walls. Beatrice followed, the steps groaning beneath their weight. The deeper they went, the stronger the scent of soil and age pressed around them. At the bottom stretched a stone tunnel, long and narrow, its walls dark with centuries of dust. Then came the sound. At first faint, then clearer, the rise of laughter mingled with voices speaking in low tones. Not prayerful tones, but hushed exchanges of affection. Margaret's heart pounded as she moved forward, the light of her candle guiding her into the unknown. When the tunnel opened into a hidden chamber, the truth struck her like a blow. There, in the flickering glow of concealed candles, novices from St. Cecilia's stood locked in embraces with young men dressed in the simple cassocks of seminarians. These were no intruders, no strangers. They were students from St. Benedict's Seminary, the institution that lay just beyond the convent walls. The tunnel had been their secret bridge, carrying them back and forth beneath the ground. Margaret's voice thundered across the chamber. "What is this?" The couples tore apart, faces draining of color. One novice covered her mouth, another turned to flee, but none escaped Margaret's stare. The air reeked of guilt. Finally, Elena Cruz stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears. "Mother, we did not mean to shame you. We tried to keep our vows, but our hearts betrayed us. We could not stop meeting them. We loved them." Her trembling voice cracked, the weight of confession spilling out. Margaret's candle shook as the full horror settled in. The pregnancies, the sickness, the secrecy, it was all explained. The young men of St. Benedict's Seminary had been slipping into the convent through this tunnel, and forbidden romance had blossomed into acts that none could deny. Her chest burned with fury and grief. These were not abstract sins, but living deceptions carried out beneath her feet. And yet, as her gaze moved across the faces before her, she saw not defiance, but fear, shame, and deep regret. They were young, overwhelmed by feelings larger than their vows, ensnared in secrecy they could not control. Margaret steadied her breath. Her voice cut firm but low. "You have broken trust, you have broken vows, but the truth has found you. From this night forward, you will no longer hide in shadows." The chamber fell silent. The forbidden romance was no longer a secret. It was exposed, raw, and undeniable. And with it came the certainty that nothing in St. Cecilia's convent would ever be the same again. The chamber in the tunnel was suffocating with silence after Margaret's words. The novices stood pale. The seminarians bowed their heads. The candles flickered as though straining against the weight of judgment. Margaret's heart pounded, torn between fury and compassion. The truth had been laid bare. Romance had taken root in secrecy, and the vows of both convent and seminary lay broken in her hands. Margaret did not delay. She ordered Beatrice to bring word to the seminary leaders. Within the hour, Father Gregory and Father Samuel arrived, their faces dark with disbelief as they stepped into the underground chamber. They recognized the cassocks of their own students and the shame written across their expressions. Father Gregory's voice trembled as he addressed them. "You were to be shepherds, guardians of faith. Instead, you have chosen secrecy and desire. Do you know the weight of the vows you've broken?" The young seminarians lowered their eyes, unable to answer. One muttered through tears, "We did not mean to dishonor the church, but our hearts betrayed us." Father Samuel's jaw tightened. Hearts without discipline become chains. And now you have bound yourselves, and these women, to consequences you cannot undo. Margaret raised her hand, silencing the chamber. "Enough. Judgment will come, but not in anger. We will not bury this in silence. We will face it together." In the days that followed, the convent and seminary were thrown into turmoil. Margaret convened meetings in the great hall, the sisters sitting on one side, seminarians on the other, with the priests and Dr. Lillian Harper at the center. No secret was left unspoken. Each novice admitted her choices, each seminarian confessed his role. It was painful, humiliating, but it was honest. Dr. Harper, with calm authority, took charge of the expectant mothers. She explained the needs of pregnancy, nutrition, rest, medical care, and reminded everyone that their first duty now was to protect life. Her presence grounded the community, shifting the focus from shame to responsibility. For Margaret, the hardest task was speaking to the sisters who had remained faithful. Many were devastated, their trust shattered, their faith shaken. Margaret stood before them in the chapel, her voice steady though her heart ached. Yes, vows were broken. But if our faith cannot survive the truth, then it was never faith at all. This crisis is not the end of us. It is the beginning of something that will demand more of our compassion than ever before. The community listened, some with tears, some with quiet anger, but all knowing their Mother Superior would not abandon them to despair. The scandal could no longer be hidden. It demanded not only punishment, but also a path forward, and Margaret knew that whatever decision she made next would define the future of both St. Cecilia's Convent and St. Benedict's Seminary. When the first letters went out, families arrived at St. Cecilia's in waves, mothers with tear-streaked faces, fathers with clenched jaws, siblings who could barely contain their disbelief. Some demanded answers, others wept openly, all of them shocked to find their daughters and sons entangled in scandal behind sacred walls. Margaret faced them in the great hall, her voice calm but resolute. "You deserve truth, and you will have it. Your children broke vows, yes, but they did not lose their souls. They are not exiled, they are not condemned, they are accountable, and they will be given the chance to choose their path honestly." The days that followed were filled with painful but necessary conversations. Families sat with their daughters, with the young seminarians, with Dr. Harper and the priests. Arguments flared, tears flowed, but step by step, anger began to soften. For some families, the news was too heavy. They left bitter, struggling to accept what had happened. Yet for many others, love eventually overcame disappointment. Parents chose to support their children rather than cast them away. Margaret and Fathers Gregory and Samuel set clear lines of resolution. Those who wished to remain in their religious life were offered the chance to recommit to their vows under stricter guidance and renewed accountability. Those whose hearts were bound to their partners were permitted to leave, with dignity, their marriages to be blessed rather than hidden in shame. In time, a collective decision took shape. The couples who chose to marry would do so openly in the presence of their families, the convent, and the seminary. The act would transform what began as scandal into a moment of painful but necessary redemption. As preparations for the weddings began, Margaret ordered the tunnel unsealed permanently. No longer a dark passage of secrecy, it would stand as a symbolic bridge between two communities that had lived too long in isolation. Where lies had once traveled, now there would be prayer, dialogue, and transparency. Dr. Harper continued her devoted care, guiding the young mothers through their pregnancies. Her presence, steady and compassionate, reassured everyone that the future of these children would be secured. She often reminded the community, love without responsibility destroys. Love with responsibility redeems. By the time spring returned to the hillside, the convent was no longer defined by its silence, but by its resilience. Families who had once come with outrage now returned with gifts, support, and even joy, preparing for a wedding unlike any the convent had ever known. The day of the ceremony arrived not with spectacle, but with simplicity. No jewels, no lavish vestments, only families gathered in quiet rows, waiting to witness what they never thought they would see. The brides stood in plain white, their hands trembling but steady. The seminarians wore their cassocks, no longer symbols of secrecy, but of young men stepping into responsibility. When they spoke their vows, there was no grandeur, only honesty. Their voices cracked, but they carried. As each pair exchanged rings, tears broke freely in the crowd, not from shame, but from the fragile beauty of watching what had been hidden in darkness come into the light. The hymn that followed did not celebrate perfection. It celebrated survival. That night, Mother Margaret walked alone through the convent, the echoes of the day still lingering in her ears. She did not go to the garden or the hall. She went to the infirmary, where Elena lay resting, her hand over the life growing inside her. Margaret stood silently, watching the young woman sleep. It was then she understood. This was the true test. Not the exposure of sin, not the confrontation of secrecy, but what came after. The care, the guidance, the courage to raise both children and faith side by side. She whispered a prayer as she turned away. Lord, give me the strength to lead not flawless souls, but fragile ones. In time, St. Cecilia's convent was remembered not for scandal, but for how it faced scandal, with honesty, accountability, and compassion. The tunnel remained, not as a passage of shame, but as a monument to truth, a reminder that what is hidden will always come to light. And in that truth, the convent endured. Not perfect, not unbroken, but stronger, because it had chosen mercy over silence. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, when truth is revealed, do we cling to judgment, or do we open our hearts to mercy? We love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that explore faith, forgiveness, and the human heart. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again in the next story.